Under the pale light of a hidden moon, Sergeant Elias Ward clung to the thick, rain-slicked trunk of an ancient oak deep in the war-ravaged forest. His weathered hands gripping the rough bark with the same quiet strength that had carried him through 5 decades of life and hardship. At 61, he was old enough to be the father, or even grandfather, of most of the young men who'd fought alongside him earlier that day, before the ambush had scattered them like leaves before a storm, leaving him alone in hostile territory. His breath was steady despite the thud of distant artillery shaking the damp earth below, and the wet, earthy scent of the forest mixed with the faint, acrid tang of spent gunpowder drifting on the night breeze. Beneath him, a narrow game trail cut through the undergrowth, and the muffled clank of enemy gear reached his ears long before the first shadowy figures appeared, their rifles slung lazily, unaware of the man perched just a few feet above their heads. He pressed himself tighter against the trunk, every muscle still as stone, his mind sifting through decades of soldiering and survival, recalling the still hunts of his youth in the Appalachian woods where patience and silence meant meat on the table for his family during lean years. One by one, the enemy patrol moved beneath him. 5 men, their boots squelching in the mud, their voices low but careless, their discipline softened by what they thought was the safety of night and numbers. Elias felt a slow-burning resolve settle in his chest. These men had likely been part of the group that cut down his unit earlier, and though his hair was gray and his knees ached in the cold, his mind was sharp as ever, and the odds tonight would belong to cunning, not youth. He waited until the last of them had passed before moving, descending from the tree with deliberate slowness, each step down the gnarled trunk placed so carefully it made no sound over the wind whispering through the leaves. Once on the ground, he stayed low, shadowing the patrol from behind, noting the gaps in their formation, the lazy way they scanned the forest, the heavy packs weighing them down. His mind worked quickly, building a trap from the terrain itself. This stretch of forest narrowed ahead between 2 ridges, a natural choke point he'd hunted deer through many times before in another life. Slipping ahead of them by cutting through a tangle of brambles they avoided, he reached the pass first, positioned himself behind a fallen log, and set the plan in motion. He didn't need gunfire to win this. He needed presence, authority, and the kind of voice that carried conviction even an enemy could feel in their bones. As the patrol entered the gap, Elias rose from cover like a shadow becoming flesh, rifle leveled, stance steady, his voice booming in the night with a command to drop their weapons, the barrel of his weapon moving with deliberate slowness from man to man, his eyes unblinking. The surprise was complete. The first man froze mid-step, the second's mouth opened in shock, and within moments, 5 rifles clattered into the mud, the enemy's hands lifting in silent surrender. He stepped forward, corralling them with the ease of a man who'd herded stubborn mules in his youth, keeping them close, their eyes darting nervously to the woods around them, wondering how many others might be there. Elias didn't tell them there was no one else. He just kept moving them toward friendly lines, every step a quiet victory, proof that age and experience could outmaneuver raw strength. The forest swallowed their trail, and by the time the first streaks of dawn lit the sky, the old sergeant had led his captives into the safety of his own side, delivering them without a shot fired, a testament to the power of patience, positioning, and the unshakable will of a man too seasoned to be caught off guard. The dawn was still young when Elias handed the 5 prisoners over to a squad of wide-eyed young soldiers who looked at him as though he had stepped out of some old war movie, their disbelief plain in the way they studied the gray in his beard and the steady grip of his calloused hands. They asked how he'd done it, but he only shook his head, muttering something about keeping your boots dry and your eyes open, then turned away, because the job was not finished. Not yet. The prisoners carried more than just rifles. Slung across their backs were heavy packs, and in those packs Elias suspected there was more than rations and spare socks. In a small tent near the command post, the bags were emptied onto a table, spilling out not only ammunition and maps but also a battered field radio, its dials worn, the casing dented, and a rolled piece of oilcloth that, when unwrapped, revealed a sheaf of papers covered in coordinates and notations in a language Elias couldn't read but had learned to recognize long ago as enemy cipher work. The captain in charge was a fresh-faced officer barely 30. His hair too neat for war, and though he tried to hide it, his tone when he spoke to Elias carried a polite condescension, as if he thought the older man's usefulness ended with bringing in the prisoners. "We'll handle it from here," the captain said, already turning away to speak with his staff, but Elias had caught something, a faint smudge of charcoal on the edge of one of the maps, marking a symbol he knew from his years in uniform, a place deep in the forest the enemy had used in conflicts past. It was an old supply depot, long abandoned, or so the younger soldiers believed. To Elias, it was exactly the kind of place they might be using again, tucked out of sight from air reconnaissance, shielded by the dense canopy. When he suggested it, the captain brushed it off, citing more pressing priorities. But Elias knew better. If the enemy was moving through these woods with such confidence, it meant they had a safe harbor nearby. That night, he decided not to wait for permission. The moon was bright enough to see by, silver light filtering through skeletal branches as he moved alone into the trees, the cold air cutting through his jacket, the forest floor crunching faintly under his careful steps. He used the old routes he'd learned decades before, avoiding the main trails, keeping to dry ground where no mud would record his passing. Hours into the march, he caught the first sign. A faint metallic clang drifting through the stillness, followed by the smell of burning wood mixed with the tang of diesel fuel. Flattening himself behind a rise, he crawled forward until he could peer over the lip and see them. Half a dozen enemy soldiers gathered near a low structure camouflaged with branches and tarps, the glow of a fire flickering inside, the shadows of others moving beyond. He watched, unmoving, noting patterns. 2 guards at the entrance, another walking a slow perimeter, the rest inside. No sentries in the trees, no tripwires, no high lookouts, too confident, too sure of their secrecy. That would be their undoing. He retreated quietly, circling wide until he found a vantage point on higher ground where the moonlight caught the glint of something just beyond the treeline. Fuel drums, stacked carelessly near the edge of the camp, their tops open to the night air. A plan began to take shape, one that would use not firepower, but the forest itself and the panic of a startled enemy. He would need to move fast and quiet, and he would need help. At dawn, he returned to camp and found Corporal Harris, a wiry young man from Tennessee who'd once listened to Elias's stories of hunting in the hills and knew enough to trust him when others didn't. Harris didn't hesitate when Elias explained. Together they gathered a few essentials, lengths of cord, 2 canteens of fuel, and a pair of smoke grenades, then set out again before the sun climbed high. They moved like ghosts through the woods, taking positions before noon, Harris slipping down to the fuel drums while Elias crawled close enough to see the guards' faces. At the signal, a flick of the hand, Harris poured fuel in a line leading away from the drums into a patch of dry leaves and brush, then set it smoldering. The fire crept slowly at first, unnoticed, until the wind shifted and carried the scent of smoke into the camp. Panic came in waves, the guards shouted, men spilled out of the structure, some grabbing rifles, others buckets, their formation broken, their focus scattered. That was when Elias acted, stepping from the shadows with his rifle at the ready, his voice cutting through the chaos, commanding them to drop their weapons just as he had with the patrol. The smoke thickened, stinging eyes, blinding some, and Harris emerged from the opposite side, his own weapon trained on the enemy. Surrounded and disoriented, they had no choice but to comply, dropping rifles, coughing in the haze. In minutes, the camp was theirs, the remaining supplies intact, the prisoners bound and ready for escort. Back at base, even the captain could not hide his grudging respect, though his praise was stiff and formal. Elias didn't care about the words. What mattered was the look in the eyes of the younger soldiers, a mix of admiration and newfound trust, the kind that couldn't be ordered, only earned. And yet, as he lay that night under the thin canvas of his tent, Elias knew the forest still held more of the enemy, and his work, like the war itself, was far from over. ChatGPT. The wind shifted on the 3rd day after the depot raid, carrying with it the faint echo of gunfire somewhere to the east, a reminder that the forest was still contested ground and that victory here was never permanent. Elias Ward stood at the edge of camp, the cold biting at his cheeks, his breath curling in the morning air, watching as a squad of young soldiers prepared to move out toward the sound. He had no orders to join them, but he'd learned over decades of soldiering that waiting for permission in war was often the same as wasting time, and the intelligence gathered from the captured depot hinted at something bigger, a coordinated push from the enemy through a narrow valley north of their position, a place where the terrain funneled movement like water in a creek bed. He knew that valley from years ago, back when it was just hunting ground for deer and the occasional black bear, and he knew it could be turned into a trap if the right minds and hands worked it. The captain still saw him as a relic, more useful for stories than strategy, but Elias wasn't about to sit idle while the enemy poured through a choke point into friendly territory. By mid-morning, he'd gathered Corporal Harris and 2 others, Private Langley, a sharp-eyed farm boy from Iowa, and Specialist Ortiz, a quiet man with a knack for explosives, and laid out his idea. They would get ahead of the enemy in the valley, used the high ground and a few well-placed charges to make it seem as though they were facing a much larger force, sowing confusion long enough for the main unit to regroup and block the pass. Moving through the forest, they kept low, speaking in murmurs, boots muffled by damp leaves. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and distant smoke, and the occasional snap of a twig made Elias's heart beat harder, not from fear, but from the anticipation of putting his plan to work. By late afternoon they reached the southern rim of the valley, its floor lying in shadow between two steep ridges. They could see the enemy advancing in staggered columns, their movement careful but not hurried, confident in their numbers. Elias scanned the slope, spotting outcroppings of rock and clusters of boulders that could serve as both cover and echo chambers for the sounds they would create. Ortiz set to work rigging small charges behind the rocks, not to kill but to boom and crack like heavier weapons when detonated. Langley and Harris laid out strips of metal and empty canteens along narrow trails where the enemy might step, the clatter of their disturbance meant to mimic hidden troops shifting in position. As the sun sank lower, Elias positioned himself on a thick branch halfway up a massive beech tree that overlooked the valley floor, rifle steady, eyes fixed on the lead elements of the enemy force. He waited, letting them move deeper into the narrowing ground, until they were in range of every hidden noisemaker and charge. With a short, sharp whistle, the plan sprang to life. Ortiz's charges thundered in rapid succession, echoing off the ridges like artillery, while Langley and Harris rattled the metal strips, shouting commands that bounced and doubled in the valley's natural acoustics. The enemy froze, heads whipping in every direction, some dropping to their knees in panic, others pulling back toward the rear. Elias fired a single shot, deliberately aimed at a rock near their lead man, the bullet sparking off stone, a warning more than a kill. In the chaos, squads broke formation, their officers shouting conflicting orders, the valley filled with the noise of men convinced they were walking into an ambush from a far larger force than 4 men could ever be. Taking advantage of their confusion, Elias signaled Harris to lead the younger men in a slow, deliberate advance along the ridge, making just enough movement to be seen in fleeting glimpses through the trees, reinforcing the illusion. Within minutes, the enemy began to pull back, the retreat messy, supplies abandoned in their haste to get out of what they believed was a kill zone. Elias didn't chase. He knew better than to push their luck, but as they regrouped, he felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal glory and everything to do with proving that experience, patience, and a clear head could turn the tide without spilling unnecessary blood. They gathered the abandoned crates, food, ammunition, even medical supplies desperately needed back at camp, and began the trek home under the rising moon, the forest quiet again except for the soft crunch of their boots. By the time they returned, word of what they'd done had already spread. The captain himself met them at the edge of camp, this time without the stiff formality, his handshake firm, his eyes meeting Elias's with genuine respect. Around the fire that night, the younger soldiers listened without mockery as Elias spoke of the valley and the way sound could be a weapon, their faces lit by the flickering flames, their nods slow and thoughtful. He didn't boast, didn't claim it as some great victory, but deep inside he knew that the lesson had sunk in, that sometimes the strongest weapon a man could carry was the wisdom earned over years, the knowledge of when to strike and when to hold back. As the camp settled into quiet, Elias sat alone for a while, staring into the embers, thinking about the path that had brought him here, from the hills of his youth to the wars of his younger days and now, again, to the edge of danger. He felt no bitterness at the years behind him, only a steady pride in having proven that age was not a weakness but a shield, forged in trials long past. Tomorrow, the war would continue, the forest would still hide both friend and foe, and the young would still think themselves invincible. But tonight, Elias Ward had shown them another truth, that the overlooked could still change the course of a battle, and that wisdom, once earned, could never be taken away. By the time dawn broke over the ridge, the valley lay still again, save for the faint rustle of wind through the pines, and Elias Ward found himself pacing the edge of camp as if movement alone could keep the restless energy at bay. The skirmish 2 nights before had given them breathing room, but in war breathing room was never more than the space between 2 storms. He'd slept little, drifting in and out on a cot that creaked at the slightest shift. His dreams tangled with images of the retreating enemy and the glint of abandoned rifles under the moonlight. Harris had checked the perimeter twice before sunrise, reporting no signs of movement, but Elias knew better than to believe the quiet. He took a dented tin mug of coffee from the cook, its surface shimmering faintly in the thin morning light, and walked toward the observation post they'd set on the western slope. The young sentry there, barely 20 if that, stiffened at his approach, saluting awkwardly before returning to the scope of his binoculars. From up here, The land rolled away in folds of mist, the outlines of distant hills barely visible, but to the north a blackened smear of smoke hinted at a fresh camp or perhaps the aftermath of some clash they had not been part of. Elias asked the sentry how long it had been there. The boy shrugged, saying he'd noticed it just after first light. That, to Elias, was enough reason to act. Within the hour, he'd assembled Harris, Langley, and Ortiz again, their gear hastily checked and strapped down. They moved north along an old logging road, their breath clouding in the cool air, boots muffled in the thick carpet of pine needles. The forest here was older, the trunks thicker, the canopy so dense that the sun only managed thin slivers of gold. As they pushed deeper, Elias's mind kept returning to the smoke, to what it meant. Another push, perhaps, or a resupply station that could feed the enemy's advance. By midday, they reached the crest of a low hill, and there below lay a shallow basin dotted with tents and makeshift fortifications. The smoke rose from a large pit where men in enemy uniforms burned debris, but it was the trucks lined up along the far side that caught Elias's attention. 6 of them, covered in tarpaulins, guarded by only a handful of sentries. This was no mere outpost. This was a staging ground, and if those trucks rolled out, they'd carry enough supplies to fuel another offensive. Elias crouched, pulling the others close, sketching a rough plan in the dirt. Ortiz would take the eastern slope, planting charges near the trucks. Harris and Langley would move south to cut off any escape along the ravine. Elias himself would slip in from the north, close enough to draw the sentries' eyes. They waited for the wind to shift, for the smoke from the pit to drift eastward and give them cover, then moved. The approach was slow, every step measured, every sound considered. Elias reached the northern fence, a loose stretch of wire more symbolic than defensive, and slid under. A sentry stood nearby, leaning on his rifle, eyes half-lidded with boredom. Elias kept to the shadows of stacked crates until he was close enough to hear the man hum under his breath, then tossed a pebble toward the far end of the fence. The sentry turned, taking 2 steps toward the sound, and in that instant Elias slipped past him. Somewhere to the east, a dull metallic clink told him Ortiz was at work. Seconds later, the crack of a branch in the south signaled Harris and Langley in position. Elias crouched behind a truck, the smell of fuel strong, and waited. When the first of Ortiz's charges went off, it wasn't the truck that exploded but a barrel nearby, its blast sending up a plume of dust and fire that rattled the camp. The sentries scrambled, shouting orders, firing blindly into the trees. Elias rose, rifle steady, and put 2 shots into the dirt near the central tent, driving the enemy inward, away from the trucks. Another blast, louder, rolled in from the east, and flames licked at the tarpaulin covers. Harris's rifle cracked from the south, picking off the only sentry who'd tried to flee down the ravine. In less than 3 minutes, the camp was chaos, supplies burning, men retreating toward the pit in a futile attempt to regroup. Elias signaled the others to pull back, knowing that staying too long would draw reinforcements. They vanished into the forest as the last truck went up in a fireball, the sound echoing for miles. By nightfall, they were back at camp, smoke still clinging to their clothes, their faces streaked with soot. The captain called them into his tent, maps spread wide on the table, and for the first time asked Elias not for a report, but for advice. It was a subtle shift, but one the older man felt deeply. They spoke long into the night about the terrain, the enemy's likely fallback points, and the narrow windows in which they could strike without being crushed by sheer numbers. Outside, the campfires burned low, and somewhere an owl called into the darkness. Elias left the tent with the sense that the days ahead would not be easier, but perhaps, at last, they would be fought on ground of his choosing.